The freezing Chicago wind cut straight through my wool coat as I stood on my own snow-covered porch, staring at the heavy oak front door that had just been locked from the inside by my own daughter. In my shaking hand, I clutched the only thing I was allowed to grab, my late wife's framed photograph, while my son-in-law's final words echoed in my ears, telling me I was nothing but a senile, useless burden. They thought they had finally broken me, that an old, lonely man would just fade away into a state-funded nursing home without a fight. But as I looked at the dark windows of the house I built, the tears in my eyes turned to ice, and I knew that what I was going to do next would utterly dismantle their lives. Before I begin my story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, there right now. It would make me happy to know how far my voice has reached across the world. My name is Arthur Pendleton. If you met me a few years ago, you probably would have thought I was the most predictable, ordinary man in the world. For 32 years, I lived my life by the numbers. I worked as a licensed certified public accountant, CPA, right in the heart of downtown Chicago. To me, numbers were beautiful because they never lied. They were clean, they were logical, and they balanced out perfectly at the end of the day. I spent my entire career helping people protect their wealth, auditing corporate books and navigating the absolute mess of the American tax system. I built a reputation as a man who could spot a hidden financial discrepancy from a mile away. But while I was brilliant at auditing business ledgers, I was completely blind when it came to auditing the people I loved. I always believed that family was a sacred, unbreakable bond. I thought that if you poured your soul, your time, and your protection into your flesh and blood, it created a safety net that would hold you up when the rest of the world crumbled. I learned the hard way that some people don't see a safety net. They see an open wallet and a target. The foundation of my world began to fracture 5 years ago. My beautiful wife, Eleanor, was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. For 2 grueling years, our lives became a blur of sterile hospital waiting rooms, aggressive chemotherapy sessions, and midnight drives to the emergency room. I watched the most vibrant, loving woman I had ever known slowly waste away. I put my career on the back burner, taking on fewer clients just so I could sit by her bedside, holding her hand, and whispering that everything was going to be okay, even when I knew it wasn't. When she finally drew her last breath, a massive, suffocating void opened up in my chest. In that dark, empty world, I clung desperately to the only piece of Eleanor I had left, our daughter, Chloe. Chloe was our absolute pride and joy. When Eleanor passed, I swore a silent oath to my late wife's memory that I would protect our daughter from every harsh reality of life. I wanted to make sure she never felt abandoned, never felt the sting of financial insecurity, and always knew she had a father who would drop everything to catch her if she fell. Because of that overwhelming grief and love, I became fiercely protective of her. If she needed something, she got it before she even had to ask. If she made a mistake, I cleaned it up. I thought I was being a devoted, supportive father. I thought I was honoring Eleanor's memory by keeping our fractured family whole. But looking back now, with the cold clarity of hindsight, I realize I wasn't just supporting Chloe. I was enabling her. I was shielding her from the consequences of the real world, raising her to believe that her comfort was everyone else's responsibility. I never taught her the value of sacrifice, because I was always the one doing the sacrificing. And because of that innocence, because of my desperate need to keep my daughter close to me in a world that felt incredibly lonely without my wife, I became the perfect target for a calculated, systematic betrayal. I opened my doors, my heart, and my bank accounts to a pair of parasites, completely oblivious to the fact that they were preparing to drain me dry. The real trouble started when Brandon entered the picture. Brandon was a slick-talking, sharp-dressed guy who claimed to be a high-end luxury real estate agent in Chicago. He always wore tailored suits, drove a leased luxury car he couldn't afford, and used words like synergy, scaling, and 7-figure volume. To anyone looking from the outside, he seemed like a young man on the rise. But I had spent over 3 decades looking behind the curtains of people's financial lives. Within 10 minutes of meeting him at a family dinner, I could smell the desperation on him. He talked too much about money for someone who supposedly had a lot of it. Against my better judgment, I kept my mouth shut because Chloe was deeply in love. She looked at him like he hung the moon. When they got married, I threw them a beautiful wedding, paying the entire $35,000 bill myself just to see my daughter smile. I wanted so badly for Brandon to be the man Chloe thought he was. But numbers don't lie, and it didn't take long for Brandon's house of cards to collapse. About 2 years into their marriage, Chloe came to my house late one night, sobbing. Brandon's real estate business was in absolute freefall. He had mismanaged his commissions, blown thousands of dollars on expensive dinners to impress clients who never bought anything, and skipped out on his quarterly taxes. To make matters worse, his credit score had plummeted to a disastrous 420. No reputable landlord in the city of Chicago would lease them a decent apartment, and the bank was threatening to repossess his car. They were on the verge of eviction and financial ruin. Seeing my daughter in such distress broke my heart. I remembered the promise I made to Eleanor. I looked at my large 4-bedroom colonial home in the historic district of Chicago, the home Eleanor and I had spent 30 years lovingly restoring. Since my wife's passing, the house had felt entirely too big, echoing with memories and empty space. I thought to myself, this is what family is for. I told Chloe to dry her tears. I opened my home to them, completely rent-free, so they could get back on their feet. I told them, stay here for a year or two, save your money, clear your debts, and rebuild. I thought I was giving them a launch pad. In reality, I was letting a fox into the henhouse. From the very day they moved in, the dynamic of my quiet home shifted. I became the invisible provider. Because I wanted them to maximize their savings, I took care of every single household expense. I paid the $800 monthly utility and heating bills, which skyrocketed the moment they moved in, because Brandon insisted on keeping the house at a tropical 75 degrees all through the brutal Chicago winter. I handled the $1,200 monthly organic grocery bill, stocking the pantry with the expensive steaks and premium wines Brandon demanded. But my sacrifices didn't stop at room and board. One afternoon, Brandon came to me with a somber face, explaining that he was losing high-end real estate clients because his current car was embarrassing and depreciating his professional brand. He found a pristine $45,000 BMW, but because of his 420 credit score, the dealership wouldn't even let him test drive it without a cosigner. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Arthur, if you co-sign this for me, I swear this will be the turning point for my agency. I'll be able to pay you back for everything within 6 months." Again, for the sake of my daughter's financial stability, I walked into that dealership and put my perfect credit score on the line. I co-signed the loan. And within 3 months, Brandon forgot to make the payments, forcing me to quietly take over the $650 monthly auto note myself, just to protect my own credit from being dragged into the mud with his. I was acting as an ATM, a landlord, and a safety net all at once, while Brandon and Chloe lived like royalty under my roof. Then came the ultimate trap, the move that they thought would seal my fate. Brandon came home one evening ecstatic, claiming he had found a loophole to acquire a distressed multifamily property in the suburbs that could yield massive rental income. He just needed a clean escrow account to route the investor funds through to avoid high corporate tax brackets. He suggested we open a high-yield joint business checking account at Chase Bank. "Arthur," he pleaded, "you're a CPA. Your name on the account gives us instant credibility with the investors. We'll make you a partner. This will secure your retirement, and we can finally pay you back every dime we owe you." Chloe stood right next to him, gripping my hand. "Please, Dad, do this for our future. We want to make you proud." Looking back, the warning bells should have been deafening, but I looked at my daughter's face, saw her desperate desire for success, and I relented. We went to Chase Bank and we opened the joint business checking account. I was listed as the primary account holder and creator because my financial credentials were required to bypass the bank's strict risk assessment protocols, but Brandon was given full authorized user access and secondary signing rights. I deposited a chunk of my own remaining liquid capital to establish the account's baseline creditworthiness, believing I was finally helping my children build a legacy. I thought I was being a visionary father, securing a comfortable retirement where we would all be taken care of. I didn't realize that Brandon and Chloe weren't looking at the account as a business venture. They were looking at it as a rope to tie my hands behind my back. They believed that once my name was legally bound to their financial dealings, I would be trapped, unable to move against them without destroying myself. They took my kindness for absolute weakness, completely forgetting that while numbers can be used to build a cage, a master accountant knows exactly which bars to cut to break free. It didn't happen all at once. The disrespect crept into my home like a slow-moving mold. Once the joint account was opened and they felt entirely secure under my roof, the masks began to slip. It started with small things. Brandon began rearranging the furniture in the living room without asking me, tossing out Eleanor's favorite armchair because he said it ruined the aesthetic for his Zoom calls. Chloe stopped asking what I wanted for dinner. She would just order takeout for herself and Brandon, leaving me to forage for leftovers in a kitchen I paid to stock. Whenever I tried to speak up, Brandon would chuckle condescendingly and say, "Arthur, relax. You're retired now. Your brain doesn't need to stress over these little details. Just sit back and let the young professionals handle things." Chloe would just look at her phone, completely indifferent to how her husband was diminishing me in my own house. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, tolerated only because my pension and savings kept their lifestyle afloat. The absolute breaking point, the moment that shattered my world forever, happened on a freezing, bitter Tuesday evening in mid-January. A massive blizzard was rolling through Chicago, and the wind outside was howling against the windows. I was in the kitchen trying to stay out of their way. I felt a deep ache in my lower back, a stubborn reminder of my age, and my hands were stiff from a mild bout of arthritis. I was carefully brewing a pot of black coffee, looking out the window at the snow drifting against the glass. Brandon had spread his things out across the entire quartz kitchen island. He had his brand new $1,200 Apple Watch Ultra sitting on a charger, alongside a disorganized stack of unnotarized real estate contracts and sensitive client listings for a property he was desperately trying to close. He was pacing back and forth, shouting into his Bluetooth earpiece, arguing with an underwriter about a loan approval that was falling through. As I turned around to pour my coffee into a mug, a sudden sharp jolt of arthritic pain shot through my right wrist. My grip failed. The heavy ceramic mug slipped from my fingers, crashing violently onto the quartz island. Dark, scalding liquid splashed everywhere. It completely soaked Brandon's paperwork, ruining the printed contracts, and pooled directly underneath his expensive Apple Watch. Brandon stopped talking mid-sentence. His face turned an angry, deep purple. He ripped the earpiece out of his ear and let out a roar of absolute narcissistic rage. "What the hell did you just do, you old fool?" he screamed, stepping into my personal space. "Brandon, I am so sorry," I stammered, raising my hands. "My wrist just gave out. It was an accident. I'll help you print out new—" "An accident?" Brandon didn't let me finish. Before I could even react, he reached out and shoved me hard. He didn't just push me, he threw his entire weight into it. Because of my bad back and the slippery kitchen floor, I lost my footing completely. I flew backward, crashing heavily onto the living room sofa, my shoulder slamming against the wooden armrest. There was no physical blood, but the sheer shock of the violation left me breathless. I sat there, stunned, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked up, expecting my daughter to come running from the hallway to pull her husband off me. I expected her to scream at him for putting his hands on her father. Chloe walked into the room looking at the mess on the island, and then looked down at me sitting on the sofa. Her expression wasn't one of shock or worry. It was cold, detached, and dripping with disgust. "Dad, look at yourself," Chloe said, her voice completely flat. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Brandon is right. You're losing it. Your hands are shaking, you're clumsy, and you're destroying our business documents. You're becoming a massive liability to our careers and our mental health." "Chloe," I whispered, staring at her as if she were a stranger. "He just put his hands on me. In my own house." "It's not just your house anymore, Arthur," Brandon shouted, standing right next to Chloe like a united front. "We live here. We do the real work around here. You're just a senile old man who hoards a prime piece of real estate while we're trying to build a future. You belong in a state-funded assisted living facility where professionals can watch you chew your food." Chloe nodded in agreement. "We've talked about this, Dad. You need to do the right thing for this family. Tomorrow morning, you're going to sign the deed of this house over to Brandon and me so we can use the equity to fix our credit. And then you need to pack a bag and leave. We can't live like this under your shadow anymore." "I am not signing my home over to anyone," I said, my voice trembling but firm as I stood up from the sofa. "This is Eleanor's house. I paid for it. I pay for everything you put in your mouths." Brandon laughed, a sickening, arrogant sound. He walked over to the front closet, grabbed my heavy wool winter coat and threw it hard at my chest. Then he grabbed me by the arm, his fingers digging deep into my skin, and dragged me toward the front door. I tried to pull back, but he was younger and stronger. He unlocked the deadbolt, threw the heavy oak door open, and forcefully pushed me out onto the front porch. "Brandon, stop!" I yelled, but it was too late. The freezing Chicago air slapped my face, instantly taking my breath away. Before the door slammed shut, I managed to reach down and grab the one thing sitting on the entryway console table, the framed photograph of Eleanor. Slam! The heavy deadbolt clicked into place from the inside. I stood there on the snow-covered wood of the porch, the temperature sitting at a brutal 12 degrees. The dark windows of my own house stared back at me, completely indifferent. Inside, I could see the warm, golden glow of the thermostat set to 75 degrees, a luxury I paid for. I could hear Brandon and Chloe laughing faintly from the kitchen as they turned off the porch lights, leaving me in the pitch-black freezing dark. I sat in the driver's seat of my old sedan, the engine idling and the heater blasting a weak, desperate stream of air against the frost forming on the windshield. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the steering wheel. I placed Eleanor's framed photograph on the passenger seat beside me, the dim dashboard lights illuminating her beautiful, smiling face. A heavy, suffocating wave of grief washed over me. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream at the sky and ask how the little girl I had tucked into bed, the daughter I had protected from every harsh gust of wind life through her way, could leave me to freeze to death on my own porch. For 30 minutes I was just a broken father wallowing in the wreckage of his own misplaced devotion. The pain in my shoulder where I had slammed against the sofa throbbed in sync with the heavy pounding in my chest. They thought I was finished. They thought an old man battered by grief and age would just drive himself to a cheap motel, curl up in a corner, and quietly sign over his life's work just to beg for a shred of their validation. But then, my eyes drifted back to Eleanor's photo. I looked at the fierce, dignified strength in her eyes. She hadn't raised a coward, and I hadn't spent 32 years auditing the most ruthless corporate sharks in Chicago just to be dismantled by a failed real estate agent and an ungrateful child. Slowly, the trembling in my hands stopped. The suffocating grief in my chest began to lift, replaced by a cold, sharp, mathematical stillness. The emotional fog cleared, and my brain did what it had always done best. It started calculating. Numbers don't have feelings. They don't cry, they don't experience heartbreak, and they certainly don't show mercy to those who violate the ledger. Brandon and Chloe had made a fatal error. They had mistaken my parental patience for absolute weakness. They genuinely believed that because I loved them, I was incapable of defending myself. They thought that by locking me out of the physical house, they had locked me out of my life. They completely forgot who actually held the keys. I looked down at my phone. I didn't call Chloe to beg her to open the door. I didn't send a furious caps lock text message to Brandon. That's what angry, powerless people do. Instead, I opened my banking app, pulled up the joint business account records, and watched the digital ledger update in real time. I saw a pending transfer of $115,000, client escrow funds for Brandon's upcoming suburban property deal, routed entirely through the architecture I had established. A slow, grim smile formed on my face in the dark interior of the car. I wiped the remaining moisture from my face, gripped the steering wheel with steady fingers, and shifted the car into drive. The Shviug, heartbroken father who left that porch 30 minutes ago, was gone. In his place was an expert auditor who was about to initiate the most brutal, calculated forensic teardown of their entire existence. They wanted to gamble with my life? Fine. I was going to use the exact financial and legal systems they took for granted to systematically erase them. I didn't check into a cheap motel. I drove straight to a quiet boutique hotel downtown, ordered a hot pot of black coffee, and spent the entire night hunched over my laptop. By 8 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in the mahogany-lined office of my longtime attorney and friend, Marcus Vance. Marcus had handled Eleanor's estate, and he knew exactly what that house meant to me. When I told him what happened, his face turned to stone. "Arthur," Marcus said, leaning across his desk. "In the state of Illinois, what they did isn't just a family dispute. It's a felony. We are going to bury them." We started with step 1, the legal shield. Marcus drafted an emergency petition for an ex parte restraining order based on elderly physical and emotional abuse. I provided him with 2 irrefutable pieces of evidence. First, the high-definition footage from my Ring doorbell camera, which I had downloaded onto my phone, clearly showing Brandon aggressively dragging me across the threshold and shoving me into the sub-zero night. Second, I had secretly kept my phone's voice recorder running in my pocket during the confrontation. Brandon's voice was crystal clear, screaming that I was a senile old fool who belonged in an asylum, while Chloe demanded I sign over the deed. By 11:30 a.m., a Cook County judge signed the emergency protective order. Legally, Brandon was now prohibited from coming within 100 yards of me my vehicle, or my place of business. If he breached it, he went straight to jail. Then came step 2, the financial guillotine. At 1 p.m., I walked into the main branch of Chase Bank on Dearborn Street. I met directly with the branch manager, showing him my credentials as a licensed CPA and the primary creator and tax identifier of the joint business checking account. "Mr. Pendleton," the manager said, looking at the paperwork, "as the primary entity holder, you have total administrative control over the account architecture." "Excellent," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "I want to exercise my right to freeze the account entirely due to suspected fraudulent activity and internal structural liability." With a few clicks of his mouse, the manager executed my command. The pending $115,000 transfer, which represented the entire earnest money deposit from Brandon's biggest real estate clients for a commercial property deal, was instantly locked in financial purgatory. Brandon couldn't touch a single dime. To add to the pressure, I removed Brandon as an authorized user from my personal credit lines. I called the credit card companies and canceled the secondary cards I had given them for emergencies. Instantly, their ability to buy groceries, fill the BMW with gas, or pay for their online marketing vanished. I cut their financial oxygen supply with the stroke of a pen. Finally, step 3, the eviction. Brandon and Chloe genuinely believed that because they lived in my house, they had tenant rights that would take months to litigate under Chicago's strict housing laws. But they forgot that I was a master of contracts. Because they had never signed a formal lease agreement and paid exactly $0 in rent, they were legally classified as tenants at will. More importantly, because we had just filed official criminal charges for elder abuse, their standard tenant protections were completely nullified. Marcus drafted a formal 3-day notice to quit for illegal conduct and elder abuse. This wasn't a polite request, it was a legal countdown. At 4 p.m., a professional burly process server walked up my driveway, knocked on the heavy oak door, and handed a stunned Chloe the paperwork. For the next 72 hours, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Chloe called me 32 times. Brandon sent dozens of frantic, threatening text messages, which gradually turned into pathetic, whimpering pleas as his business credit cards began bouncing all over the city. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't reply to a single text. I simply forwarded every message to Marcus to add to our harassment log. I sat in my hotel room drinking tea, watching the numbers balance out. They had thought they could treat my life like a bad business negotiation. They were about to find out what happens when the auditor finally closes the ledger. On the 4th morning, exactly at 10 a.m., the 3-day notice expired. I drove up to my house in the historic district. I wasn't alone. Parked right behind me were 2 Cook County Sheriff vehicles. 2 armed deputies stepped out, adjusting their belts, ready to enforce the court order. I walked up the porch steps, the same steps where I had been left to freeze just days prior. I unlocked the heavy oak door with my key and stepped inside. The house smelled stale. Brandon and Chloe were sitting in the living room, surrounded by half-packed cardboard boxes. They looked pale, exhausted, and utterly defeated. The arrogance was completely gone. Over the last 72 hours, Brandon's real estate business had shattered into pieces. Because the $115,000 escrow account was frozen, his clients had filed an official complaint with the state licensing board for breach of contract and fraud. The lead deputy stepped forward, holding the paperwork. "Brandon Vance, Chloe Vance, your legal time is up. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your essential clothes in garbage bags and vacate these premises. Anything left behind will be considered abandoned property." Brandon's face twisted in desperate rage. He stood up and took an aggressive step toward me. "Arthur, you old bastard, you destroyed my life. You ruined my company." The moment he stepped toward me, the 2 deputies lunged. They grabbed Brandon, slammed him face first against the court's kitchen island, the very spot where he had pushed me, and pulled his arms behind his back. Click. The steel handcuffs locked around his wrists. "Brandon Vance, you are under arrest for violating an active emergency protective order and resisting a lawful eviction." Chloe let out a piercing shriek, falling to her knees on the hardwood floor. She grabbed the hem of my coat, sobbing hysterically, her mascara running down her face. "Dad, please stop this. Brandon will lose his license forever. Our credit score is ruined. No one will ever lease an apartment to us in this city. We have nowhere to go. Please, Dad, I'm your daughter." I looked down at her. I felt no anger, no hatred, and no satisfaction. I just felt an overwhelming, hollow emptiness. I gently pulled my coat out of her grip. "The night you locked me out in the freezing blizzard, Chloe," I said, my voice completely calm and cold as ice. "You buried the daughter I raised. Now you get to experience the real world you thought I was a liability to. Time's up." The deputies dragged a cursing, weeping Brandon out the door, while Chloe stumbled behind them, carrying 2 black garbage bags filled with clothes forced onto the snowy pavement of the street. The heavy oak door shut behind them, and for the first time in years, the house was completely silent. I didn't keep the house. The memories of the betrayal had stained the walls. Within a month, I put the historic colonial property on the market and sold it for a massive cash profit of nearly $750,000. I packed my belongings, took Eleanor's framed photograph, and drove all the way down to Naples, Florida. Today I live in a beautiful, sun-drenched cottage just 3 blocks from the ocean. My daily schedule has absolutely nothing to do with corporate tax forms, bad debts, or ungrateful family. I spend my mornings volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic financial literacy to young couples, and my afternoons playing golf under the Florida sun. My bank accounts are secure, my mind is completely clear, and my home is filled with peace. I finally learned the ultimate lesson of the ledger. When someone treats your kindness like a weakness, you don't argue with them. You just close their account forever. If you loved this story of cold, calculated justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss out on our next gripping first-person confession. Subscribe today and join the family.